Jamie Howard, thank you for coming in today for episode number 156, 7, one of those.
Yeah, well, it's really a great honor. You know, I've been a big fan of the podcast for a long time, and I've always dreamed of coming on. So, like a dream come true.
Yeah, thank you very much. And your brother was a fan too. We had him on. It's good to see him in Chicago earlier this year.
Yeah, absolutely. He's really loving it there, and I know I've listened to his podcast more than once, and that was a big reason I wanted to come on as well.
Nice. Yeah. That was a good fit, I think, Chicago for him.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, my oldest brother too went to Chicago, and it's just this very sort of, it's like this hub of people who are just love learning for the sake of learning and going down like intellectual rabbit holes, and that's kind of always been the type of guy Jeffrey is. Like he was never necessarily as involved with like, you know, Malio and portrayal, all these different extracurriculars in the way I am, but I think he's been always someone who's just really interested in things. And, you know, I remember a lot last year when he was a senior and he had a lot more time. We would go on like a lot of late night drives, sometimes all the way up to Pennsylvania, and we would just talk about like, I mean, sometimes he'd just lecture me about some interesting math concept that he was exploring because he's more of a STEM guy. And, I'm not that good at math, so I didn't fully understand a lot of it, but I think it's just the passion that he had. I think that's a big reason why Chicago wanted him, and I think that's the type of person you get at Chicago. So
now, are you more into humanities, history, English? I mean, I remember observing your class last year, Mr. Rao's English class, maybe one of the best classes I've ever seen of, you know, in my life at Gilman. You guys were just firing on all cylinders. Are you more into English and history and that sort of thing, or did you get the Howard like abstract math gene?
Well, it's kind of funny you mentioned that because you say like Howard abstract math gene, and like Jeffrey's really the only one in our family who is really into math.
Okay.
Like Jack is hardcore humanities. He was never like a math. He's interested in it, and I'm interested in it too. But like, I guess my mind just doesn't really work in that way, in the same way it does for Jeffrey. Like he's just able to make the connections like that so easy for him. And that's not to say Jeffrey isn't interested in humanities. Like we talk a lot about politics and reading, but I think his heart lies more with math, whereas mine and Jack's, my oldest brother, definitely lies more with like reading. Jack, when he was in high school, was more interested in like literature, like books, and I'm definitely into that. I think maybe my specific subsection of humanities is more like politics, history, that sort of realm. So.
You're sort of the opposite of me. So you have two older brothers. I've got two younger sisters.
Yeah. I've always sort of been, I've always identified myself kind of by being the youngest of three, and I've thought about this a lot. This is actually what I wrote my Common App essay on, is my relationship as the youngest brother of three, and sort of what you learn from having two brothers who certainly challenge you. And I'm not going to pretend like my relationship with my brothers has been like perfect throughout all the time. And we've had like, you know, various family stuff that's, you know, we've had to struggle with together. But I think when I look at it sort of now, I really would not be the person I am today. In particular, I don't think I'd have the confidence that I have to sort of express my opinion that I do today, because, I mean, when you're the youngest brother, you have two older brothers, especially because the way a lot of our discussions would work out, it was oftentimes a 2 versus 1, and I was the 1, and Jack and Jeffrey were the 2. So there were a lot of times in discussions I was like pinned against a wall. I had to be able to defend myself.
Yeah.
And I think that, like you were talking about Mr. Rao's English class, like I think that's helped me be able to think for myself and express myself in a way that I'm eternally grateful for them for sort of giving me that sort of skill. And I think I like to think that Jack and Jeffrey have gotten different things, but, you know, have gotten a lot out of our relationship as sort of a trio as well.
Well, I think one of the things that worked really well in that English class, and maybe this is due to birth order and being the youngest sibling, because I would guess as the youngest sibling, you have to carve your own path and make your voice heard amongst the, you know, the older brothers who just by dint of being older, they feel like they're right all the time. You've got to figure out a way to win the argument. I feel like in a good English class, you have to have a few people who are sort of disagreeable or sort of lawyer-esque, like you and Minkin and a few of the Bryn Mawr students in that class. You guys, if something didn't sound right or something was off slightly, whoa, let's rewind, let's rephrase that, let's actually get this precisely correct, because if not, it's wrong, right? And you need that, or else everyone just sits there and like, oh, that sounds good. Right, you need some people disagreeing.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I won't speak for Zach, but I think it's true that both of us, will perhaps will express an opinion that we don't necessarily 100% agree with or are convinced by, just for the sake of like keeping things interesting and sort of, the intellectual exercise of like, what if we explore this, like this, maybe we should flesh out what you're saying a little bit more. And I think that just made for a lot of really interesting discussions in that English class. Like you said, there were a lot of Bryn Mawr girls as well who sort of we were all just very willing to, it was all respectful. It was never like we had a personal grudge against anyone, but I think we were all very willing to sort of not just accept even what Mr. Rowell said, he would put forth something and we'd be like, I see that, but I don't fully agree and here's why. And I think it might be the best class I took at Gilman for that reason, because I think that a lot of my other English classes, people, like the combination of people, people weren't always as prone to sort of just getting in those sorts of discussions. So I think that's what makes a really great English class, and I'm sure in your English classes you try to cultivate that environment as well.
I try to, and you know what? A lot of the time it really is a personality chemistry thing. It's like you need those students that are going to speak up and say, I don't actually agree with you, Jamie, that Emerson was saying this about the I in nature, right? I remember observing that class when you guys were talking about Emerson and nature, and no one was just okay with saying this is what it is. It was a discussion. It was an argument. It was back and forth, and that's good. I mean, that's how it should be.
Yeah, it's funny. I guess we were talking about the transparent eyeball when you were there.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was just. I think when you talk about something like that and just transcendentalism in general, like there's so many different ways you can approach it, and like so especially like you can kind of take what Emerson was talking about over 100 years ago and apply it to the modern day, and there's just so many different connections you can make. And so unless you're just not really sort of willing to dive deeper, I think there's always something new or something different that you can say about it from the next person.
Yeah. So. Yeah, those were great. So are you reading Infinite Jest right now? Is that true?
So I've talked with you a little bit about this before. So my dad is a David Foster Wallace super fan. He just recently actually put a bumper sticker on his car. It says 1079, and that's the number of pages that are in Infinite Jest. So,
oh my gosh,
yeah, he's a really big fan, and
wow.
I've throughout as I've grown up, I've listened to some of the classics. Like I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this have heard of "This Is Water," which was the 2005, I want to say Kenyon College commencement speech he gave, which it's like a really powerful reflection on like life and sort of finding meaning and purpose as an adult in the modern day world. And I have like a book of that speech that I've read like countless times. There's also,
I always think of that speech at the grocery store, because isn't there a part in that speech where it's like you're going to be an adult one day and you're going to be doing the 9 to 5 and you're going to go to the grocery store at 6 o'clock when you get off work and you're not going to want to be there and there's going to be a really long line. I always, when it's a crowded grocery store and I don't want to be shopping right now, I always think about that speech.
Yeah. No, I think I've thought about that a lot too. Just that general idea of like taking yourself a little bit out of your head and just like sort of thinking broader about like you're not the only one feeling this. Everybody in this grocery store has the exact same feeling as you. And I think another thing that speech touched on is being willing to give people the benefit of the doubt in situations where like if somebody cuts you off on the highway and you're like really mad, consider maybe that their wife is sick and they're trying to get to the hospital, or their wife's in labor or something. I think it's important to be almost radically willing to give people the benefit of the doubt and see the best in people. And I think that Wallace really touched on that in that speech. But not just This Is Water. This August, actually, I was driving down to Florida with Jeffrey, and I was just, for whatever reason, came across the story Good Old Neon. It's in Oblivion, one of his like short story collections.
It's a long story.
It's very long. It's like 40 pages, and I was listening to it on audio. It was like an hour and a half. But I highly recommend it for anyone who's interested. I will caution that it's a very sort of dark story. It's not like it's not going to cheer you up at the end, but it essentially follows this guy who ends up killing himself, and he's talking sort of about his life, reflecting from this sort of liminal space between sort of, I guess, heaven or like the afterlife and death. he's talking basically about the exact moment when, he commits suicide. And he talks about how he felt like a fraud his entire life, and how everything he did was sort of to please other people. And I don't know. I think it made me think a lot about, obviously I'm not feeling that to the same degree, but I think in high school, a lot of kids feel like they have to do things solely to impress people or to fit a certain persona. And I think it's just made me think about, like, what is, like, the real me? Who do I want to be? And so I there's a lot more to the story. It's, I don't want to spend the entire time explaining it, but I highly recommend that story to anyone who's interested in the entire corpus of David Foster Wallace's works. It's just amazing.
Well, it's amazing how much he was able to produce and how much he was able to write. I mean, Infinite Jest, which I read this past summer, I was dragging with that book. It was long, it was brilliant, and you can tell this guy is a true genius. But to produce that many words and put them in a book, and then to realize that there are so many other stories and books, and The Pale King, for instance, is maybe almost as long as Infinite Jest. His mind was just, insanely large. He just had so many things to say and put out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to read Infinite Jest, but I mean, I think it would take an entire lifetime to not only read.
It's a project.
But you'd have to digest everything that he wrote. I think you'd need multiple lifetimes probably.
Well, what was interesting about doing this in a book club, which I would strongly suggest for any of these really, really long books, is we would meet for the book club, and the book club I was in was only 3 people. So, like, one person would have picked up and noticed, X, Y, and Z, and the other 2 of us would have been like, I totally missed that. I don't even know what you're talking about right now, because there's so much, it's so dense that, I think you need to read it more than once. I don't think I'm going to read this book again anytime soon, but there's so much in there that it's hard to just focus on one thing.
Yeah, and as I'm sure you remember from Infinite Jest, like, one thing that David Foster Wallace is very famous for is these, like, really dense footnotes that he puts at the bottom, or not at the bottom of every page. I think they're all at the end of the book. But, like, every single small detail within Infinite Jest and anything he writes, there's so much to it. He gives it so much thought. And so, like you said, like, you're never going to be able to pick up on all of it. You need multiple people and multiple perspectives to really understand it.
Yeah, sometimes one of the footnotes is like 7 pages long.
Yeah,
you flip to the back of the book, and then you have to read 7 more pages before you return to the story.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
So that's on the list. You just need some time before you read Infinite Jest.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to you about this because I was hoping you might be able to join us for a few of our book club sessions. But
I'd love to.
Yeah, and hopefully we're able to organize at least a few before the end of the year. But, life gets in the way. I've been so busy, and it's hard to find a time. But before the end of the year, I think we're going to try to have at least a few meetings and really dive deep on that. So, yeah.
So what are you doing here at Gilman in the last couple of months of school that's keeping you busy?
So definitely, like, after college applications, like, I was from basically August, September until basically the end of winter break. Like, that was all I was thinking about. Like, college, I've got to get these college applications done. I've got to write essays. I've got to do this. I've got to do that. But now that I have all my college applications in, and teachers have relaxed a little bit their workload, it's actually been kind of it's been interesting trying to find, like, because, like, in the past I've been like, oh, I have mock trial, I have to do this, I have to prepare my cross-examination, or I have Model UN, I have to prepare this trip. But now I've had more time to, like, kind of just sit with myself and think, what do I want to do with my time now that I have a little bit more control over that? So some of the things that I've tried to do, I've definitely tried to read more. Like, diving straight into something like David Foster Wallace is tough because, like you said, it's so dense. But I'm just trying to, literally sit down and read a little bit. So one thing I'm reading right now is called Animal by Lisa Tade, I believe her name is. And she's, it's just sort of this, it's kind of like a thriller book. It's like a page turner. But I think it's really important, like, for everyone to be reading something, not just in the classroom, to be reading that outside of school and, keep those sorts of, keep that process going. So I've tried to be doing that. I've also just sort of taken advantage of the time to be able to hang out with friends more. Like, on the weekends, I'm not as worried about, like, I've got to get this biology assignment done. I'm able to say, like, hey, text my closest friends, like, do you want to go get some lunch? Do you want to go play football or something? and that's been really great too. So I think I'm just trying to, you know, maybe build a little bit more routine into my life that's not just like work, clubs, sleep, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's been a challenge for sure, but I think I'm getting there.
That's awesome. Are you, as a future politician or someone who's interested in politics, are you into watching like House of Cards or, you know, political movies, or reading books about politics and, you know, presidents and cabinets and, you know, historical events? Do you do that stuff on the side or not really?
Yeah, I definitely have. So I love House of Cards, which you mentioned. It's I wouldn't say it's particularly realistic, but it's a great show, and I love kind of following like the sort of the election campaign that they have. I think it was like season 5 was like the 2020 election that they simulated. So I love just like sort of seeing that, and it's kind of fun because it's like I forget what his Frank Underwood's like this like conniving evil character who like, you know, somehow manages to always get what he wants. That's really fun to watch. But also I've read a lot of just sort of like books about like elections. So I read a few years ago I read a book about the 1948 presidential election, which I don't know if you're familiar at all.
48 was
Truman versus Dewey.
Truman. Yeah. And Dewey, did Dewey win the popular vote or no?
No.
What's the picture? So I'm not here yet in my U.S. history class. I'll get here. Okay. I'll refresh my memory. But Truman is holding up the newspaper like he won. He did win. But there was some...
So I know the image you're talking about. It's one of the most famous images in American politics, and it's Harry Truman after winning the election. He's holding up a newspaper from the Chicago Tribune, which says Dewey defeats Truman.
Yes,
because the Chicago Tribune was so sure that Dewey was going to win the election. They surveyed 50 political analysts in America before the election. All but one said that Dewey was going to win the election, and Truman ended up winning. And I think it's one of the great like comeback stories of American politics because Harry Truman, who honestly is something of like an idol for me, he's one of my favorite politicians in American politics. Was this like he was a senator from Missouri. He wasn't.
He's a shoe salesman.
He was a shoe salesman. He's from like rural Missouri. He basically got put into the vice presidential position by chance. Like he was he was FDR's vice president because FDR's vice president Henry Wallace was this sort of too radical, and the party said you need to kick him out. So they said, okay, we're scrambling. They pick Harry Truman, and then FDR is reelected in 1944. 82 days later, he passes away. And so Harry Truman, who's kind of just not ready for the national stage, is put in the position of ending the Second World War, dropping making the decision to drop the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also managing the post-war economy in the United States. And for somebody who didn't have that sort of level of national experience and just wasn't quite ready, it was quite the adjustment for him, and he got absolutely walloped in the 1946 midterm elections leading up to the presidential election because people just said this guy's not ready. He's the economy's terrible. They were very discontent with the current situation. But I think he did a train sort of tour throughout the country in the lead up to the 1948 election, and he went to all throughout small town America and sort of painted himself as this like down to earth regular guy. He's concerned with common folk, common people, and he was able to win the election by about 4 points. So I think it speaks to how American politics, you have the ability to sort of change minds and hearts if you're willing to really put yourself out there and you're willing to sort of put your heart into it. So I love the story of the 1948 election. That's one book that I've read.
Now, was he a one-term? He comes in 48. Does he leave 4 years later?
So he was technically eligible in 52, but at that point he'd basically served 8 years. And by 1952, he was pretty unpopular because the Korean War was taking place and people weren't very happy with his handling of it. So he did not run for what would have been a third term, although he was technically eligible.
So after Truman is Eisenhower comes in. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So why is Truman so interesting to you? Why is he like a politician that you aspire to, or who inspires you?
Well, I think when you think of like a politician, the stereotype of a politician is somebody who never messes up their words. They always have a line to say. They're kind of always confident, always going. And Harry Truman really wasn't that. He was, like I said, he was just sort of this. He was a senator from Missouri, but he was like not really a high-ranking national politician. He had this very awkward cadence with the way he spoke. He would say like, every single one of you. Like he would emphasize every single word in a sentence, and like he was just kind of awkward in a way that you wouldn't expect from a typical politician. But despite that, he was able to overcome sort of his, sort of more awkward mannerisms and convince people that he was the guy to be president.
So you've studied his speeches, you've studied his personality. Have you read any of them? I think David McCullough wrote a huge biography about him.
I haven't read that. But I have just like I've done a lot of reading online, and I really do love Harry Truman, and I'm probably going to try to read that book at some point.
So you probably haven't read it because I've had that library book at my house for the past like year and a half, and I haven't really cracked it. The reason I got that book is because Oppenheimer was coming out, and when people ask me or when I talk about like a moment in U.S. history that I would love to be like a fly on the wall, it would be the decision on behalf of Harry Truman to drop the bombs. I would like to know what that conversation was like, what was going through his mind, who was in the room. And unfortunately, Oppenheimer sort of ruins that image or that projection for me because they do it in the movie. But I wanted to find, and I never really got around to it. Now it's just sitting like under a stack of books in my house. But I wanted to find the moment in there where he makes that decision and if there's any information about why he chose to do that or what was going through his mind or what he was weighing in that moment.
Yeah, well, you've watched the Oppenheimer movie, I'm assuming, right? There was a really great scene which reinforced sort of what I love so much about Harry Truman in that movie, where Oppenheimer meets with Harry Truman like after the bombs have dropped, and Truman's basically saying to Oppenheimer like, "Thank you so much for all the research that you've done, helping develop this bomb. Like you were integral in helping us end the Second World War and prevent more suffering." And Oppenheimer starts sort of expressing his concerns about the morality of creating such a weapon of war. And Harry Truman just doesn't take it. He just says like, "Get out of my office. Like this is a decision." They
sort of paint him as evil in that, right? They sort of paint Truman as evil in the movie.
I can see what you're saying, and I think like I definitely understand that, but I think the way I kind of saw it was more like, tough decisions had to be made. There was no easy choice. If you drop the nuclear bomb, I think it was like 800,000 people died, which is absolutely terrible. If you don't drop the nuclear bomb, arguably America would have had to done a land invasion of Japan, which arguably would have led to 10 times more deaths than the nuclear bombs being dropped. And I think Truman's sort of anger at Oppenheimer in that moment was just like, you're in a position to be able to sort of be concerned about like the abstract moral sort of implications of creating this bomb. I'm the president. I had to make this tough decision, and I had to sort of be responsible for it. Like I don't have time for you to sort of give me this about how, I'm concerned about the morals. Like what's done is done. We had to make a choice. And, I think he just wasn't at all impressed by Oppenheimer's sort of abstract moral concerns about it.
Gotcha. Okay, so you saw it less as, as Harry Truman's being cold-blooded. It's just the role of the office, and decisions like this have to be made. And Oppenheimer talking about the feelings and the emotions and whatever that goes into that morality of the decision. Doesn't matter. We have to do this versus the alternative.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's how I interpret it.
Yeah.
I mean, you might have gotten something else, and I'm sure plenty of other people.
It just felt cold-blooded. It just felt like there was no introspection into Truman's weighing of the decision or considering the morality of it. It just felt like, bam, there's the decision.
That's true. And I mean, I'd love to read more. I haven't yet, but I'd love to read more specifically on what Truman was thinking when he was weighing, like which option to go for. I mean, personally, this is, I guess, a separate debate. I think he made the right choice, but I mean, there's a very tough decision to make, obviously.
So. Like his letters, I think letters are some of the most interesting parts of history because they're, real, the physical evidence of maybe the more vulnerable aspects to decision making that people are undergoing, like Churchill's letters or Truman's letters or whoever, that you don't maybe get in a biographical portrayal or in a documentary or a movie like we're talking about. You actually get it from the source.
Yeah.
Right.
Definitely. And I think you mentioned like Truman. I think like when you just sort of take the result of what they do, or you just sort of take the action that they took and don't consider like the deliberation, you miss out on like who these people really were. Like Churchill is an absolutely fascinating political figure. I haven't read much on him, but I wrote a paper on his sort of speeches during the London Blitz in 10th grade, and his sort of personality of being very sort of, I guess, this is what we have to do. This is not like being strong and confident in wartime. Like, I think you miss out on like the nuances of people's personalities when you just consider like, this is what happened. This is a choice that they decided to make.
Yeah, there's a good movie on Churchill too, Darkest Hour. I don't know if you've seen that, but
I haven't, but I'll add that to my list.
yeah, it's a good one. Interesting. So let's talk about the Senate youth that you just experienced, what that was like. I know that was a big deal for you and for Gilman sending you to this event. Tell me more about it, because I don't know. I just know that you were selected for it, and it sounds like it was a pretty positive experience.
Oh yeah, it was amazing. And first off, I just want to thank Mr. Smythe and Mr. Schmick for their role in making this happen. Mr. Smythe nominated me last year, where I was a finalist, but I didn't make it, and this year as well. And Mr. Schmick not only wrote me my letter of recommendation for this to apply for this program, but he's been such sort of an important person in like guiding me through the process, and also just my time on like student council, teaching me about what leadership means. So I really owe them a debt of gratitude for all that they've done for me. But the process was basically I just applied. I had to take sort of a civics test. And I have been fortunate I've spent a lot of my free time in the past 5 or 6 years on basically just researching the nuances and like sort of the small details of American politics. So like one question that I was able to get right was, what is the only state in the country that doesn't have automatic voter registration? And the answer was North Dakota, because I just happened to come across that in one of my, looking through Wikipedia one night. And I just happened to gain that piece of knowledge. But like, those were the sorts of questions that they sort of expected. I think they were trying to differentiate like who really has sort of engrossed themselves in civics and politics and who maybe just follows it kind of in passing. So I ended up making it to the top 10, and there was an interview, and I was selected as one of 2 delegates from Maryland to go to this program. So essentially I was in Washington, D.C. for a week. And to be completely honest with you, it was probably the best week of my life. I mean, as somebody who follows politics really closely, and just like I met Elena Kagan, the Supreme Court Justice, and we were able to ask her questions. I met Pete Buttigieg, who's been a political idol of mine for a long time.
Wow.
And was able to sort of see him speak. He was very personal with us, because he'd actually done the program as well about 25 years ago. And just various other figures like that. But I'll spare you all the details. I'll focus on the biggest sort of portion of the week, which was Thursday night. After President Biden gave his State of the Union speech, he came back to the White House, and he greeted like all of the Senate youth delegates in the East Wing of the White House, and told us sort of his story of how he became involved in politics as a young person in his 1972 Delaware Senate campaign, how important he thinks young people are to the process of politics. And it's funny to think about, because I think that these days, like, Biden's seen as sort of an older person these days and sort of representative of the old guard. But I thought it was really interesting to hear about how he considered young people to have such an important role in politics. And Joe Biden was one of the people who really got me into politics to the extent I am today, because, I followed the 2020 election obsessively, because there wasn't really much else to do during COVID, so I would just spend all my time following the polls and looking at the various election maps. And so I was very familiar with him, and I'd seen his speeches, probably watched hours and hours of his speeches, and he's been sort of an important political figure in my life. So to go from seeing him on TV to being literally 2 feet away from him was like one of the greatest experiences of my life. And I'm never gonna forget that. But honestly, even more significant than that, perhaps, was just meeting all these there were 2 delegates from every state, DC, and then people who are on military bases around the world, and just every possible perspective on any issue you could think of. But everyone was respectful. I had discussions with there was a delegate from New Hampshire who I very staunchly disagreed with on basically every political issue, but we were able to have some very substantive conversations about like sort of and identify where our sort of ideological differences lied. And I think that's what's missing so much in our politics these days is we're just not like we're so in our own worlds, and it's so easy to, especially with social media, to create your own bubble that we never are really willing to expose ourselves to other people and to other perspectives. And I think through doing that, I gained a certain like understanding of like, I mean, I didn't agree with him, but I knew where he was coming from, which was important. So I think it was a really amazing week, and yeah.
That sounds awesome. Now, how many students like you were there, or how many people from high schools were there?
So it was juniors and seniors in high school, two from every state, DC, and then like around the world. So it was 104 total, including me. So 103 other students.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So were you at the State of You weren't at the State of the Union. You were at the White House.
We actually watched the State of the Union from the East Wing of the White House.
Wow.
Yeah. So I will admit I purposefully went to I went into the bathroom of the White House they have like these very nice like presidential like embalmed paper towels, and like I was like grabbing, they gave us like presidential themed M&Ms and like Skittles, and like I don't know, it was very cool to just sort of be in the White House and see all these sort of, you see, I mean, a lot of people have sort of stood behind the gates, and I've done that before, but to actually be in the White House was like,
yeah,
it's hard to believe it was real.
Now, did you have to go through a lot of security checks to be admitted to this? I mean, to just be in the White House itself, or what was that like?
It wasn't too bad. It was basically just we went through like 2 security checkpoints. I showed them my ID, like typical what you'd experience at the airport, like taking off your belt and like your phone and whatnot. But it wasn't like, intense like pat down, like asking about your family history or anything. It was about what you'd expect if you went through like TSA or something.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you, as someone who is really interested in politics, who follows politics a lot, and I want to ask my class a little bit more about this. Like, how do you keep track of the reality of what's going on in the country, and where do you get your news? And like, if you're on X or if you're on Twitter, do you follow certain people on the right, certain people on the left, certain people in the middle? Do you feel like it's evenly balanced? Like, how do you know you're not living in an echo chamber when you're reading the news? Because I think about this a lot. Like, I feel like sometimes I'm just reading the same opinions. I need some new ones. I need some good arguments from other sides of this situation, because the 2024 election, it's important. There's a lot to learn about it and to prepare for. And I feel like it's very easy on our phones and on our devices to get into the echo chamber.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I will admit I'm a pretty big user of X, I call it Twitter still, but I guess people call it X now. And I think a big downside of X, though, is like you said, it's the algorithm basically curates to what you like to see. So it's so easy to just get everything like, I happen to be a Democrat, so everything from like the Democratic perspective, and if you're a Republican, just getting Republican perspectives. And it wants you to stay on the app for as long as it can. So it's going to give you what you want to see.
Right.
And I've tried my best to sort of diversify, I guess, my political news, but I think I didn't realize until like Washington week, when I met all these people from across the country, like just how much of a bubble I'm in. Because I think I follow politics too much from my perspective. I talk to people who essentially agree with my perspective like 95% of the time, and I don't spend enough time entertaining other perspectives. So that's something that I'm going to be honest, I need to work on as well. I'm not going to necessarily say I can give advice to people, but what I've been trying to do is reach out to people who disagree with you, especially people like in person, because people on a personal level, when you know their heart, when you know them outside of politics, you're far less likely to just think, oh, you're wrong, you're coming at it from the wrong perspective, because you know them. You know that they're a good person, they are smart, they have valuable things to contribute. And just make sure to, like, within like a social media context and on the news, please don't just watch like MSNBC. Please don't just watch Fox News. Try to, either watch both, or there's one sort of newsletter that Brooks Kitchell, he's your advisee. He recommended to me called All Sides, which gives you a perspective from the right wing, or a perspective from the left, and a perspective from the center on like sort of every significant issue. So like Israel-Palestine, you'd have an article from Fox News, MSNBC, and I don't know, maybe Wall Street Journal for like the center perspective. I think it's just really important that like you said, you just have to be, the first step is being cognizant of the fact that you're in a bubble, and then actively taking steps to sort of become more aware of the other side and their opinions.
Do you think people your age, maybe at Gilman, are aware of like the political leanings of a lot of news media? Like if they go on a website, for instance, do you think that they know, can they take it with a grain of salt? Like how common is it for someone to go on New York Times and know New York Times is sort of center left on the left, and Fox News, if they go on foxnews.com, it's on the right?
I think people know that Fox is on the right. I think people know that MSNBC is to the left. But I think you're right. Like, the New York Times is, I think, seen as like a more reputable source. But it's true that to an extent they have a left-wing bias, and I think that's true of a lot of newspapers these days. So I think it is important. Like, I think young people do need to sort of be on the lookout for that. And I think a lot of it is reading discerningly. Like when you read something, does it seem like the language is sort of personally attacking a politician that they might not agree with? Is the language sort of tacitly endorsing a position? And I've like noticed that in like New York Times articles where it's like, this person who is a traitor to our country, not exactly that, but they'll include some sort of adjective or descriptor that's like, okay, this doesn't seem exactly down the middle. So once again, I think you just need to be, I think young people need to be sort of aware of that. I think that among my friends, and granted, I think my friends, like we all love politics, we follow it pretty closely, but I think we do a good job of like being aware of our own biases and making sure that we're not just like taking everything that we get from New York Times or, MSNBC as fact.
It's interesting because teaching U.S. history this year for the first year, there's so many events, and we were talking about, Harry Truman and just how he's depicted in this movie, and it's very hard to get a clear picture of what actually went down in history, right?
Yeah.
It's equally as hard, I think, today to get a clear picture of what happened last night. If we're talking about the State of the Union, for instance, a couple weeks ago, right? Half of Twitter, half of X will say Joe Biden did a great job. He was firm in his beliefs. He gave a clear depiction of the State of the Union. He didn't seem tired at all up there. He seemed like he was telling the truth about the economy and the direction we're heading. The other half of X is like, this guy is way too old. He sounds angry, right? The meds are wearing off, people say, right? And it's interesting to hear that he greeted all of you at the White House afterwards, because if you look at one side of Twitter, you would see Joe Biden is way too old. He's going to go to bed right now, right?
Yeah.
Definitely. It's hard to make sense of what actually is going on in our country because there's so many different opinions out there. And even the blue checks, even the news magazines, even the New York Times, you don't feel like anyone is actually giving it straight.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's a clear solution to that. I can't name like this person will give it to you straight. They're not going to have any bias either way. And I think one thing to note, you're talking about like even like news reporters aren't always like giving exactly sort of the straight and narrow. Like it's not always that they're lying or giving falsehoods, but sometimes what a news reporter chooses to report on is often very sort of indicative of their political leanings. So like I'm sure Fox News was reporting on like Biden had this verbal miscue at some point during the speech, and I'm sure that MSNBC was choosing to show clips of him like being very strong and forceful. But I also just think like it's really interesting how you can take the same speech and you can just take it two entirely different ways. Because I think like the difference between forceful and angry is essentially a matter of perception. Yeah. Like they're not actually the way it's communicated is not actually that different. It's really just a matter of how you want to perceive it. So
Yeah. Another example is, I think last week Trump was making a speech at a rally and he used the term bloodbath, right? You've seen this. And half the media is clipping that and saying he's calling for a civil war if, he doesn't get his way during this election, if he doesn't win the election. The other half is saying, no, he's talking about the auto industry. If you watch the rest of the speech, he's talking about the auto industry. And it was interesting. I was watching a podcast clip and they watched the speech, and one person on the podcast said he's obviously talking about the auto industry, and the other person said no, he's calling for a civil war if he doesn't win this election, right?
Yeah.
It's
how do you get past that? That's what I've always that's what I struggle with, when we're so detached that we have different ways of understanding the world. It's I don't I struggle with how to, when you don't have the same sort of values as or you don't have the sort of same a way to interpret something, how do you come to a consensus? And it's really difficult. There's not a good answer for it.
It's really hard with our phones, social media. AI is a whole new challenge.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's definitely interesting. I mean, politics is fascinating. I follow it, and I try to be as informed as possible about things, but it's hard. It's a difficult thing. Well, Jamie, so next couple months, what are you looking forward to? And let's maybe get to your book recommendation here at the end.
For sure. So next couple months, so I'm really looking forward to finishing off this year strong, and I'm involved with student council stuff, so I want to make sure that 20 or 30 years from now, I'm I feel good about my legacy that I'm leaving at Gilman this final year, because one thing that Mr. Ledyard has talked about is it's really easy as a senior when things are easier and you don't have as much responsibility to just step back. But what you really need to do is step forward and use that extra time and energy as an opportunity to reinvest yourself in the Gilman community. So that's what I really want to try to do with some upcoming student council events. Another thing, I'm involved with a lot of clubs, with Model UN, but Mock Trial and Classics Club, trying to make sure that the clubs stay active for the next generation. So seeing who the underclassmen are who are really passionate about it and who are going to run the club well in my stead, I think is really, really important, because it's about the legacy you leave. Quinn McMahon gave a senior speech about legacy yesterday, or 2 days ago, I want to say. And he talked about the power of legacy, and it's made me think I had an amazing experience at Gilman, but I don't want my experience to be contained to my own mind. I want it to be something that, in 10, 20 years, I can come back and see the tangible impacts of what I did when I was here. So that's one thing that I'm trying to focus on, just finishing off this year strong. This summer, I'm going to be working with Bridges, the summer program, and I'll be working with Avena, who I think you had on a few weeks ago. And that's going to be really fun. I did that last summer for 4 weeks as a volunteer. And it's just really great to have, just meet kids who are, a little bit, they're not in the same environment that we are here at Gilman. They have different struggles, and I think that exposes you to a new perspective and makes you feel grateful for what you have. But I think it's also just a great opportunity to be able to engage with people on that level. And also, the kids are just really funny. They're really nice, and they're always just, they like to play football and basketball, and honestly, most of them are better than me, but it's still fun. It's fun to play with them, and they're just great. I'm really excited to do that this summer.
Love it.
Yeah, and I don't know. Do you want me to dive into college as well, or are you talking just before college?
Let's do book rec. Let's talk about your book rec. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. So my book recommendation is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. It's this story about, how would I describe it? It's centered around this group of 5 students who are all classics majors at this fictional liberal arts college in Vermont. It's called I believe it's called Bennington College, and their class is basically separate from the school, because they have this very eccentric professor who tells them that you're not allowed to take any classes besides classics classes. You have to study solely with me. We're going to learn Latin, Greek, Latin and Greek culture, etc. And so these 5 students end up becoming extremely close. They spend all their free time together, and so that ends up leading to some, I don't want to spoil anything, but that leads to some very interesting things, and some people, are kicked out of the group, and, if you're looking for a book that's going to be like a fun, easy read on like a Sunday, this would be a perfect book, because I tore through it like 100 pages a day when I read it. So
Is it a long book?
it's like 530 pages,
Okay.
I want to say. So it's not.
She wrote The Goldfinch, maybe?
Yes,
Donna Tartt?
I love The Goldfinch as well.
Yeah, I haven't read it.
Yeah, highly recommend The Goldfinch as well. But I think Secret History might be the one to start with, because it's really incredible. Yeah, I mean, there are other books that I could recommend that are more like, serious, but I think if you want a book that's just going to like really get you passionate about reading and just have an enjoyable experience, highly recommend The Secret History. So,
Love it.
yeah.
Well, thank you, sir. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Cesare, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.